Hi guys, I'm Chris. Welcome back to the Green Malt, and today we're going to talk about something slightly different. I'm going to talk about Irish whiskey. And if I was smart, I would have done this about a week ago so I could put this up coinciding with St. Patrick's Day and all of that, but I'm not that smart, so I'm doing it after St. Patrick's Day. And let's hope some people still feel the Irish spirit. So, Irish whiskey is something that probably deserves more attention than it's getting. It is a form of whiskey that's certainly on the rise. It's on the rebound. But I mean, I could go on ad nauseum about the history and different aspects of Irish whiskey, and it certainly, if it doesn't just rival Scottish history as far as Scotch goes, it might exceed it. I mean, it's pretty fascinating stuff if you're into that kind of thing anyway. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about that because I bore the socks off of most people that watch this, but if you are interested, I think I'm going to put up an article about that at some point on my website, which I'll link in the description. Um, Suffice it to say right now that Powers was formed in the late 18th century, about 1791, by a guy with the last name Powers. Became Powers and Son, and kind of transferred down through the ages. These days, it's owned by a conglomerate, and eventually ended up through various amalgamations and purchases over the years in the hands of a conglomerate called Irish Distillers. That was something that formed in the 1960s when the last three distilleries standing in Ireland, being Powers, Jameson, and Cork Distillers, formed together to form this conglomerate to try to survive. They were in turn bought out by Pernod Ricard, and who still operates it to this day. So Powers no longer has its own distillery. It's now produced in Midleton Distillery down the southeast by Cork. Um, and just to give a little bit of background, because at one point I did mention in that little ramble that there was three distilleries left operating in the 60s. By 1887, there was 28 distilleries operating in the Dublin area. It was a very popular area, or at least in Ireland. I shouldn't just specify Dublin. Irish whiskey was very popular. It was very approachable, very easy drinking. A little bit more innovative too. Innovative than Scotch whiskey. There was more allowable methods of productions, more allowable inputs to use to distill. So it was kind of a big thing in the late 19th century, early 20th century. In fact, Ireland was home to the earliest licensed distillery by royal license in 1608 in Bushmills County, which old Bushmills Distillery lays claim to now, though there's some dispute about that. I mean, that's how far back the history of distilling goes in Ireland, and like I said, by the late 19th century it was very popular because it was very approachable, very easy drinking. I mean, think about Jameson today, right? Like, you go to a bar anywhere, and I, I like Jameson from time to time, but it's not the most challenging whiskey, right? Anybody can try it. But very popular in America. Huge proportion of exports to America and to Britain and to England. But by the early 20th century, between Irish wars for independence and civil wars and the outbreak of World War One, and then Prohibition in the U.S., World War II, trade disputes with Britain, trade disputes with America, by the 60s, Irish whiskey was all but wiped out. Production was at an all-time low. Hence the merger into Irish Distillers Company to try to save brands like this. And then by the late 70s, early 80s, there's only two distilleries operating, both owned by that same conglomerate, and one was the Midleton Distillery, and one was the Bushmills Distillery. But they're on the rebound, and as of right now, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 distilleries operating in Ireland now, and I think there's another 16 or so due to open, which is great because, like I said, historically Irish distilleries have been very innovative. They've been very enterprising. They've tried new things. They've tried different stills, different inputs, using different forms of sugar to distill to form their distillate and ultimately their whiskey. I mean, that's good. I love distilleries that maintain old traditional styles, but I love those that also experiment a little bit too. So it's great to see. This is the Powers 12-year-old John's Lane, and it's called John's Lane because, like I said, Powers Distillery that opened in the late 18th century Shortly after opening, when it had to expand its capacity, moved into a distillery on John's Lane, for which it became famous, and it was recorded in the histories of a British historian that visited and really paid it some homage, and hence the name. And this is supposed to replicate the style of the time, being a single pot whiskey. What does that mean? Well, unlike scotch, which is water and malted barley, right? That's it. This is water, malted barley, and unmalted barley. So they keep aside a proportion of the barley crop that would go into the mash and ultimately be brewed up into the wort and distilled. They keep aside that proportion, and they don't malt it. They don't let it germinate, and then they don't dry it out like unmalted barley. And what does that do? That just means that there's a certain amount of the sugars, that those complex starches that haven't been changed through the germination process, and it gives it a little bit of a different character, a little bit of a different flavor profile. According to Powers, that flavor profile is supposed to be a little bit more complex, a little bit creamier mouthfeel. I mean, I think there's a lot of influences that go into that ultimate product, but could be. There's certainly flavors in pot still Irish whiskey that you don't typically find in Scotch, and that's all about the production, right? It's all about the components that go into the production. Even though the still, like it says, is a pot still, right? It's the same stills that you use in Scotch whiskey, but there's other influences on it. Now this is also triple distilled. It's run through 3 times, and that doesn't often happen. It's the minority of distilleries that will do that in Scotland. Auchentoshan is the most famous example of one that does it regularly. And I know there's other distilleries that do periodically, but it happens far more frequently in Irish whiskey. And again, it's supposed to give it a bit of a lighter, more approachable character, which is another reason why it was very popular. Now, whew, that was a lot of stuff. Anything else? I'm sure there is, but if I've forgotten, I've forgotten. This particular bottling is aged largely in bourbon casks, but there is a proportion of sherry casks as well, hence the richness of the color in addition to what I'm sure is caramel coloring. It's bottled at 46% and non-chill filtered. These are all very good things. I love non-chill filtered whiskeys. I love sherry aged whiskeys. I love whiskeys that are bottled at a little bit of a higher percentage. So far so good. I will say the first time I tried this whiskey was at a tasting bar in Dublin. This is before I knew much of anything about Irish whiskey, admittedly. And I loved it. It was at the recommendation of the bartender there, and fell in love immediately. It just spoke to me. It was hitting all my buttons. But I cheaped out and didn't buy a bottle, didn't bring it back. I had spent a lot of money on whiskey already, and regretted it ever since. I spent the last 2 years trying to find a bottle, and what didn't manage to until very recently. So here we are doing a review about it. So time to review. It's rich. It's a rich nose. That sherry influence, I don't know what the ratio is, bourbon cask to sherry cask, but the sherry influence is pungent. It's not quite on that level of the Scotch sherry bombs, right? Like the Aberlour, Abanad, and Glenfarclas 105 style sherry bombs, but it's pretty noticeable. And chocolatey. Very chocolatey. The dried fruit influence is there, like a little bit of dried raisins, but it's not punchy and sweet. Very rich dark chocolate, very rich. There's an interesting mustiness to the nose as well, and it's the kind of smell that I would definitely associate with like an old English 19th century Victorian English gentleman's drawing room, the kind of place where guys would go after dinner to smoke cigars, drink brandy, and just hang out, right? Like, there's not a lot of distinct notes that I associate with that. It's just like an overall experience. A little bit of mustiness, a little bit of leathery, tobacco-y type notes, a little bit of, oh god, I'm going to sound like Ron Burgundy, a little bit of rich mahogany, just all of that baked on in. And incidentally, I will say also, I didn't touch on this, and I don't often touch on this, because I'm not a big legs guy. I don't really pay all that much attention to the viscosity around the glass. But this does have a viscosity that you don't often see in Irish whiskies. It's pretty impressive. But I have to assume that comes off of the quality of the casks and all that good stuff. So again, the sherry influence is there, huge rich chocolate influence, that weird experiential sense of old-timey leathery mustiness. It's really great. Certainly a sweetness, a caramelly note there as well, a little bit of vanilla. It's great. I really love this nose. It's very potent though, very pungent, benefits from a few minutes in the glass. I had that there for a good 10 minutes, added a drop of water. It's great. I've also noticed, incidentally, this bottle has benefited greatly from a little bit of oxidization. When I first popped the cork on it, it was good. Wasn't what I remembered. Having been open for a week or two now, not really drained all that much, it has changed greatly. The nose has benefited hugely through that oxidization, and the palate, as we'll talk about, has as well. Like I said, rich, right? The sherry influence is big. Chocolate's a little bit more subdued now. Those dried fruit notes are coming through. Certainly raisins and dried plums and apricots. And a little bit of a dark stone fruit note there as well, with a little bit of a dark tart cherry aspect. The arrival's immediately kind of sweet. A little bit of like a honeyed note to those fruit things, right? But it dries out very, very quickly. And then it leaves you with that musty, leathery note, a little bit of a tobacco-y note. And chocolate rides through, that vanilla comes through a little bit. There's a little bit of a woody oakiness, and a little bit of something that I can't quite put my finger on, a little bit of like an ethanol-y, slightly chemically note. Yeah, I don't want to misdescribe it. Let's try again. Yeah, I don't know how to describe that. I want to say something a little bit like Vicks Vapor Rub, but I don't know why, because I've certainly never willingly tasted that. Maybe it's just that slightly chemically, slightly minty sense to the note. It's very good, don't get me wrong. Anyway, the development, though, sadly, is, I gotta say, my least favorite part of the whole experience. The nose is beautiful. The development of the whiskey in the palate is very nice. It's very pleasant. I'm a big fan of whiskeys that have that obviously sherried finish. Those leathery, tobacco-y notes in the background really speak to me, and those are really present here. The chocolate just plays in wonderfully with it. It's very, very good. The finish, though, it dries out rather quickly. There's not a lot of spiciness to this whiskey at all. There's not a lot that lingers on the back of the throat through the finish. So all you're left with is a little bit of that chocolatey note, a little bit of that leathery note, and it doesn't hang around all that long. It's okay. I guess you can't always have it all. But anyway, this is, I have to say, my favorite Irish whiskey, and I've not tried a ton of them. I'm a big fan of some of the spot releases, right? Green spot, yellow spot, and some of those cask finished green spots that have been showing up recently. Great stuff. Some of the red breast releases are really, really good as well. Some of the Jameson smaller batch releases have proven to be pretty impressive, but this tops them all for my dollar. I don't love giving oh no, let me put this another way. I'll give it a score, as subjective as that is. Doesn't mean that if I've reviewed a Scotch that I've given the same score to, that I view them identically, because it's not necessarily apples to apples, but that caveat out there. I want to give this something like an 89. No, 90. Bump it up to 90. I spent long enough trying to find it, I may as well give it a little bit of credit. 90 out of 100. I think it's an excellent, excellent whiskey. There's very little, save that little letdown on the finish. There's not a lot I would criticize about it. It's both approachable, given a little bit of time to breathe. It's both approachable, but it has some brilliant complexity to the nose and the palate. It's got some wonderful set of flavors, just blend together really, really nicely. Highly recommended. I paid about $90 US when I was down in Florida and found this bottle finally. It's a little bit on the high side of the price scale for a 12-year-old whiskey, but you know what? It's sherry cask aged, bottled at a reasonable 46%, not filtered, and it's brilliantly done, so well worth the money, I think. So, if you do find a bottle of this, give it a try. I don't think anybody will be disappointed. So, that's all for this time. I've rambled enough, and I'm sure I've missed out on a lot of little bits and pieces that surround Powers Distillery and Irish whiskey in general. Like I said, it's a huge topic that deserves way more discussion than I can squeeze into one video, so maybe I'll pick up where I left off the next time I talk about an Irish whiskey, which hopefully won't be too terribly long. If not, see if I can do a little article about it instead. So, just launch it.